At the studio of Kitchen Theory, we have Chef Alfred Prasad. Alfred is the youngest Indian chef to receive a Michelin star at the age of 29. He retained this accolade at Tamarind restaurant in Mayfair for 13 years. In 2018, Alfred opened OMYA, a fine dining Indian restaurant at the flagship, the Oberoi New Delhi hotel. The restaurant was recently awarded Best New Restaurant at the BBC Good Food Awards. Congratulations.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you so much for having me here.
No, you're more than welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. So today we're going to be discussing the art of using spices in cooking, and this is something you and I have had some really interesting chats about in the past. Food waste, sustainability, and multi-sensory dining in Indian cuisine, because this is something that I think drew the two of us together, this idea of kind of multi-sensory dining. Alfred, thank you so much for coming by. It's an absolute pleasure. I haven't seen you in months because you've been a very, very busy man.
Well, I'm glad we could make it work this time. It has been a busy summer for sure, but in between visits to Delhi, where I'm there every quarter, and recently opened a restaurant in Dublin as well, just last month. So it's been, since the start of June almost, it's been madness with lots of travel.
So you've been at Lord's Cricket Ground.
That's right.
And you've had the Cricket World Cup there.
Which was an extended season because of the World Cup, and then the domestic season kicked in after the World Cup.
Wow.
So that was a longer than typical season at Lord's.
And then you've been at the same time overseeing OMYA.
So I literally finished the last match of the season end August and flew the next day to Delhi.
Yeah.
That was my quarterly visit, and I tend to pack them avoiding the brutal summer in New Delhi.
Right.
So I do 2 earlier in the year and 2 towards between autumn and Christmas. But I was really delighted to get that news last week. Sadly, I wasn't in town. I was back in London then. But BBC Good Food nominated and voted OMYA as the best fine dining restaurant at a 5-star hotel.
Incredible.
And that's for the whole of the northern region.
Wow, congratulations. That's
Thank
amazing.
You. Thank you.
And tell me about Dublin. I didn't know you had opened something.
So Dublin's a consultancy project that I've partnered with a well-known restaurant operator in Dublin known as Press Up. Press Up own about 47 restaurants in Dublin and 4 5-star hotels.
Wow.
And but mostly in the Mediterranean, European cuisine space.
Yeah.
For the first time, Press Up opened an Indian restaurant, it's just launched last month, called Doolally.
Okay.
And it's a 220-seat premium casual Indian concept.
Okay.
So obviously a very fun, eclectic menu that I was able to curate for that. Bringing the Indian-Irish connection as well, using
What's
a lot
the
of
Indian-Irish connection.
Well, the British ruled India for 300 years, and a large proportion of that was the Irish contingent as well. And yes, we broadly say Anglo-Indians, and my mum's an Anglo-Indian herself, but it's a bastardized word for the term Eurasian, really. So you have the Dutch Indians, you have Portuguese Indians, you have British Indians, you have similarly Irish Indians as well. So this concept again is called Doolally, which as you and I know means a bit loony.
Yeah.
But I guess the idea is to get you loony about Indian food. Dublin has a very eclectic food scene now, probably not much more interesting than it was even 5 years ago. And
I was
so
over
it's
there
great to be in there.
About a year ago. I was over there more recently, but I was over there and actually got to eat out about a year ago. And it is incredible that food has become, and not just, I don't just mean kind of good food. They've had Michelin star restaurants for a while, and that scene, the fine dining scene, has been going. But
it's
in
more
terms
the
of international
mid-market
cuisines,
explosion. It's more of diversification as well. Yes, international global cuisines coming in, and cooler, grungy concepts, which is really adding to the food scene in Dublin, I think. They always had a good music scene, but now the food scene is catching up.
And so you've trained and worked in Indian cuisine for your whole career.
That's right.
What are the changes that you've seen in how it's kind of being translated and exported in different places? Because I guess in England there's a long history of having Indian
Very true.
cuisine, and now there are many Indian or British, really Indian dishes, aren't there?
That's
where
right.
they're more identifiable as being British, but using
Indian
maybe Indian ingredients and
techniques.
heritage and idea and techniques, but they wouldn't be identifiable necessarily to people in India, or they wouldn't necessarily be as well known as they are here.
That's very
right?
true. That's very true. And I think that's a natural process of evolution of cuisines. I think that's happening globally. I think the blurring of boundaries as well. But certainly there's a fair bit of Indian cuisine in the UK that would be unfamiliar to a diner in India. And there's the reverse as well, because I keep telling diners here that it's just the tip of the iceberg, what we've explored in terms of Indian cuisine. I've spent 30 years working in Indian cuisine, and I'm nowhere near explored it myself in its entirety.
Is that
I don't
how
think
you
a
feel
lifetime
about
is
it?
sufficient. I certainly do. My wife and I take about 50% out of our time that we spend on holiday with family and friends. At least a week to 10 days we take for ourselves, which is based on travel and food research. And that's just not enough, because my list is only going longer. It's not getting any shorter, sadly. There are parts of the country that are so diverse in terms of its produce that it's almost unrecognizable as Indian. Of course,
Because I always feel like when you look at something like how Japanese food has been exported, you feel that people only really know a few key kind of techniques or dishes that have really stolen the show in a way.
Right.
But when you actually go over there, you realize that, as
There's
you
a
said, it's
lot
kind of,
more.
you just haven't scratched the surface. There's so much more. And I felt the same when I went to Mexico. And I have a feeling, because shamefully enough, I haven't been to India. And I kind of have the feeling that I would find the same there.
that's something
because
we
of-
need to
We need
set
to
right.
make that happen. Don't we? Yeah, we should. Oh, that's actually that could be a way of me getting over to India. Is maybe we do a kind of interesting trip. That would be
Absolutely.
fun.
I think that'll be almost a platform or foundation towards curating this spice-based multi-sensory experience that we are hoping to create someday.
Yeah,
But
well,
that would be a good start, certainly. Get the creative juices flowing and
definitely.
experience the tastes and smells and colors of that subcontinent.
So, well, you bring me inside. So that what you just talked about there is really multisensory, and I think there is something really multisensory about Indian cuisine. And I think part of it for me has always lied in the fact that I feel more comfortable eating Indian cuisine with my hands.
Exactly, and I think it's the only way it should be eaten, to be honest.
Really?
And I hope that remains, because I know studies, I think I learned it from you the last time we met, that there is, I think Professor Charles Spence has done something on it as well, about tactile
Sure.
eating and the difference between a texture on a spoon, a rough surface enhances sweetness. Is that right?
Yeah, so there'll be correlations between the texture and the perception of sweetness, sourness, bitterness.
But I think there's a certain emotional connect with your food that happens at a different level when you consume food with your hands.
Yeah.
It's much more sensory, I think, because you're losing that element of touch and feel that you normally don't get when you're eating with cutlery or chopsticks. I think certainly there's pleasure in eating Indian food that way, and a lot of us grew up eating food that way, so it just seems natural. I can equally understand the other side of the spectrum, wondering why you would want to eat with your hands if you're just not used to it as part of your upbringing. But I think certainly the emotional connect with your food is that much stronger and deeper, perhaps due to the fact that we touch our food more.
Because Indian food is highly visual in terms of the colors and the display, and even kind of the way it's displayed on the table, right? I mean, that for me, I would say, is a big part of what makes Indian food really appetizing, is as well, the visual display.
True. Very similar to the
colours.
Middle Eastern style as well. Perhaps a lot of our cuisine is borrowed from the Middle East. I think a lot of what we know as Indian food today, certainly North Indian food today, has come from the Middle East. And that whole idea of sharing, of tasting a whole multitude of flavors in one dish and textures and color, and I think that certainly adds to the magic of the cuisine. And then you have
and the
those
aromatics as well. I think that's such a kind of intense experience as well.
When people talk about spice, they often misrepresent it as heat.
I agree.
That's only one part of spice. And when you say Indian food is spicy, I don't think you should mean that it's a Scoville scale heat.
Yeah.
Spices,
well,
like you said,
I
now
completely
is
agree with you. I
aromatics.
think there is a huge difference between spicy in the context of heat and chilies, and spiced in terms of using
aromatics.
a much wider range of very pungent, flavorful spices that don't necessarily add to the trigeminal sensation. So the tingling, the heat, the pain element, and are much more on the side of aromatics and flavor.
That's right. I mean, some have a combination of the two as well. Take, for example, cinnamon or even nutmeg. A very a tiny dose of cinnamon would probably, the first impression is the fragrance, the aroma, and then you do get the heat. Similarly with nutmeg as well. But these spices are used in traces, in microscopic quantities, really. And perhaps more for their curative properties than we seem to understand today.
Well, Indian cuisine is so well known for being spiced. As someone who has spent so many years working on finding that balance, would you say that you have mastered that balance, or is it something that shifts, or does it depend on who you're cooking for? Or I'm sure these are all kind of elements within it, but is there do you get to a point, I guess my question is, with Indian cooking where you kind of just know how to not only season but spice things to get the exact result that you're looking for?
I think it's probably very hard to say that anybody could attain spice nirvana in the way you describe it. I think as Indian chefs, we are trained from the very beginning to use our hands. We don't. It's not pastry or baking where you need precision. We tend to use our hands to add spices into a dish, and certainly that allows you to smell the aroma of the cumin powder and then decide based on its strength of aroma whether you need more or less. The quality of the spice is the key criteria, in my opinion.
How do you assess the quality of the spice? What would be your...
I think the best way to use spices at home is to buy small quantities of the best quality you can find. And often the shop-bought brands are not probably the best.
So I was going to ask you, can you get really good quality Indian spices in the UK?
The answer is yes. And in fact, I have found in my 20 years here that it's even better than you can find in India.
Really?
And there's a very simple reason for that. Like all our fantastic produce in India, the best quality fetches the best price for
gets
export.
Exported, yeah.
It happens to our seafood, it happens to all our spices,
Yeah.
and for that reason alone, you can get far superior quality of spices in one location, under one roof in London than I could get in a whole day trawling markets in New Delhi, for example.
Wow. Because I had a family friend who brought me back some spices from India, and you see, I was sitting there going on about, you see, you won't get spices like this over here. Yeah, this is the real stuff. But I guess a part of that is also the placebo of knowing that it had come from India made me kind of perhaps...
Yes, there are some things, I think. I have friends who bring in fresh curry leaves, for example, from India. You do get them, but they're flown in and quite expensive now here. Yeah. But in terms of any dry spices, the most stable spices, I think the quality you get here in London is far superior to what you get in India, both whole as well as ground. Also because our processes and health and safety regulations demand a certain standard.
Sure.
And there's no adulteration as well. In India, adulteration is a big thing. I think it sadly happens to our food as well.
Yeah.
And therefore, you cannot guarantee the quality that you get in India. But here, certainly not in the supermarkets, but there are food manufacturing industries sourced from mills largely based around Leicester that specialize in procuring the best quality of whole Indian spice. They roast them and grind them and clean them in the UK. And those certainly are the best quality. So we used to actually buy our spices for the restaurants from a factory in Leicester. So but certainly for a more home use, I think the best you can do is to buy a small quantity and grind them freshly at home. So a small coffee grinder is ideal, and grind just as much as you might use, so not too much. So those really tiny coffee grinders where you can grind 5 or 6 grams is probably the best thing to go.
And then once you've got these great spices, you've ground them, how do you use them properly? And I say properly because when I was working at the Connaught many years ago, one of my colleagues was from south of India, and I remember him showing me how he would cook the base of a curry. And it was nothing like what I would have done in terms of an approach to how I would have gone about it. And I remember that fundamentally changed how I would start a lot of kind of curries, the base, the gravy. But you're going to, I'm sure, explain a lot better.
Well,
than I can.
I think as I keep telling young chefs, the rule is that there is no rules. For the simple reason that I think each one of us are born with and blessed with a different taste perspective, a different understanding of flavor, a different understanding of likes and dislikes, as you know so well here at Kitchen Theory. And the simplest way I can suggest you delve into spices is to try them as single spices. So say fennel seeds, for example. Raw, throw some in your mouth, chew them, okay. Toasted, you'll get slightly different, more pronounced notes, more sweetness, and then that's a flavor memory that you keep aside. And then you proceed with cumin and pepper and chili and fennel and star anise and so on and so forth.
Kind of build up that and olfactory memory.
Absolutely. And then you can start working on combinations. I remember reading somewhere that Indian cuisine seems to break all the rules of flavor pairings.
Yeah.
You probably know a lot more in depth than me on that, but I remember reading it somewhere. And
there's actually more
probably
foods
also
that
explains
because in Western food they'll find that a lot of foods have
complementing
the more let's say molecules they have in common. Perhaps they might be paired together more frequently, but they found that the reverse was true of Indian and I think other Asian cuisines. Right. So yeah, there is something that's quite unique in that sense.
And I think that is true of the more ancient cuisines. Certainly, what we know as Indian cuisine today is an amalgamation of all the influences that subcontinent has had over the years, be it conquests, invasions, our neighbors, of course, and all these have resulted in this melting pot of what is Indian cuisine today. We know a large part of northern Indian food has come from the Middle East. A lot of spices from North Africa and the Middle East have been incorporated. Bread, of course, was brought from the Middle East as well as from the Portuguese. The chili and the tomato were brought to India by the Portuguese, 400 years ago? It's maybe a little more than that. But it's shocking. It's shocking to imagine Indian food today without chili or tomato, and yet you just go back 3 generations and the oldest recipe books in India would probably have pepper as the main flavoring and not chili. That's the native spice.
Really? Wow. You mentioned, or you were, as we were talking about spice and thing, because the interesting thing with spices and I'm not talking about, again, the chili kind of spice as much as I am spices in a more broader sense, apart from just being important for flavoring, they also have the importance of the kind of medicinal properties that come with them. And I think that's something that maybe now is completely overlooked when we talk about spiced foods, when we talk about the balance of flavors and all those really important aspects of enjoying food. But I think, because before we started recording, you told me your father was a doctor.
That's right, yes.
And it is interesting how far we've gone from food being seen as
curative and medicinal
in some way to today we are completely valuing food in a whole different set of criteria. A lot of it has to do with flavor.
Correct. And pleasure.
And pleasure, yeah, and the more kind of hedonistic reasons for enjoying.
Very true, very true. And yet, if we go back to, say, our grandparents' generation, their connect with food was a lot more about curative properties. All our grandmothers have home recipes and home remedies for everything from coughs to colds to eye sores to headaches and all of that, largely involving some food or spice or combination of spices. And of course, the pharmaceutical industry has for years extracted medicinal ingredients from plants and spices into what's mainstream pharmaceuticals today. And yet, this ancient knowledge that I think even now in rural India, for example, Joseph, there are people who know which root to eat to cure, say, jaundice, for example, or which leaves can be crushed up and made into a juice when you have chicken pox. It's amazing. I'm sure in the Amazon as well, and there's a lot of these natural remedies around us. Foraging has become fashionable in the last few years, but our ancestors did just that. And food was a lot more associated with healing than it is today. I think...
and there's Ayurvedic kind of... This is something we were talking about earlier as well, isn't there? Right. There's a whole cuisine or...
Philosophy almost.
Philosophy, yeah, it's probably a better word for it. That
based on food as a means of healing, based on eating according to your body type. We were chatting a little while ago about the future of gastronomy and how it could be prescription gastronomy.
Yeah.
That's what Ayurveda was about. It was about understanding your body type, and I think everybody falls into 3 major body types or combinations of. Mm-hmm. And there are food groups that are classified as suitable for those body types.
Oh, wow.
And so that, sadly, it took the Western world to make yoga and Ayurveda fashionable, but we as Indians should have just swallowed up all of that knowledge. We should have been taught it in schools as the most basic, and yet it took the Western world to almost come full cycle, and today we are talking about prescription gastronomy as being the future, something I'm particularly excited about, but also a bit saddened by the fact that that knowledge was probably a lot of it lost. Some of it we are still holding on to, but Ayurveda was all about food as a source of healing. And I think, which brings me to my philosophy of heritage, health and happiness. And that's a philosophy that I've come to develop in my 30 years of cooking. When I left Tamarind in 2015, it was like a career reset for me. And it gave me the time to think about where I want to be, what do I want to do with myself. And it helped to crystallize those ideas into a philosophy.
Because that's a tough act to follow. 13 years of holding a Michelin star in Mayfair, right? I mean, then...
Yes, I give a lot of credit for that to the fact that Michelin UK was open-minded enough back in 2001 to recognize non-French cuisines as worthy of a Michelin star. So Tamarind was actually the first Indian restaurant ever in the world to receive a Michelin star.
Oh, wow.
And it was only the year later that I think the first Oriental restaurant in London, Hakkasan, won its star. So, of course, since then, Michelin hasn't looked back. There's, 47 one-star restaurants. The first year they launched in Tokyo, and a hawker stall in Singapore now with a Michelin star. So I think, but certainly Michelin UK deserves a lot of credit, and London deserves a lot of credit for its love of Indian food.
Yeah.
I often tell people that I'm an Indian chef in the best city to be an Indian chef.
So tell me your philosophy then. When you moved on 13 years, then you went, what was it? Why was this philosophy kind of defining in some way?
I think, so in 2015 when I left Tamarind, I left with the intention of starting my own restaurant and writing my book, both of which haven't happened yet, but they are still works in progress. I think, but it also gave me a lot of time to sit and revisit. You know, when you're running a busy restaurant, you're literally going from day to day and month to month and year to year, and suddenly you realize, wow, 14 years have just vanished. But that gave me a lot of time in 2015 to actually think about what I want to do as a chef. What is the message I want to pass on? What is, if at all, a legacy that I might be able to leave behind? And it made sense to crystallize my style into what I've called the 3 pillars of my philosophy: heritage, health, and happiness. Heritage, I think, is important to all of us. I know we're talking about yoga and Ayurveda and the medicinal value of plants and spices, and all that is heritage. Heritage that has been passed down from generation to the next. There's also an element of us creating new heritage for tomorrow. And I often tell people that heritage doesn't need to be what Auguste Escoffier did as set in stone. Today's chefs do feel the sense of creating their own signature dishes. I think bring their own ideas to the plate. And it's important for chefs, I think, to think for themselves and have a big picture outlook as to what they want their food to speak. And certainly for me, heritage seemed a very important pillar to be focused on. We are the torchbearers of this heritage, passing it on to the next generation. And it also means looking at heritage dishes in a newer, modern light. How can we make them more relevant for today's diner? That's an amazing approach. Also trying to discover grandmother's recipes, recipes from rural India that are untainted by modern technology, and try and see the relevance, because the whole fact that we are talking about the future of gastronomy being prescription gastronomy, there's so much to be gathered from that lost science of food as healing that could be applicable to our current lives. Certainly, health. I think as a chef, we have a voice, we have a platform, and I have been a big believer. As I said, my dad was a doctor. Despite being an orthopedic surgeon, his preferred method of treatment was often naturopathy, and at most involving food as a medicine, despite being a doctor. And so I always grew up with those very strong beliefs of food as a medicine, and therefore health becomes equally important as a pillar in my philosophy. I think the fact that we have in the last 40 years probably moved away, we just spoke about it, from eating what's right to eating what's pleasurable, or going after the wrong things in food. And I think as chefs, if we can just raise that voice and start that conversation about food as a means of delivering health, I think we would have really done our jobs. There's no better saying than you are what you eat.
Yeah.
And I think it's becoming more and more relevant today. Happiness, certainly I think hospitality at the end of the day is about offering a wow experience, like you do here at Kitchen Theory. I mean, every one of your diners in here go mind blown, don't they? And it's about bringing out that child in the diner, I think, in the customer, and connecting at an emotional level that leaves them with a recall of a particular experience, a particular interaction with food that they had. And I think that is the biggest pleasure a chef can have, looking at smiles on their customers and making sure that you've left no stone unturned in leaving a happy diner.
Happy diners and happy chefs, and I think that's super important. I think specifically when you kind of talk about what we do at our chef's table, and I think you will completely understand this. Part of what we enjoy is obviously making our guests really happy and excited and engage them in the dining experience. But a big part of, I think, why that works is because we ourselves are so engaged in the process and enjoy it so much, and because we take so much joy out of it. And there's even research that will show you things like chefs who work in open kitchens do a better job or are happier than chefs who work in kind of basements, where I spent a lot of my early career.
I agree. I think, sadly, most central London chefs are used to working in basement kitchens, but having done the OMYA in New Delhi, which has a theatre element, especially the tandoors and the robata is a theatre element, Doolally in Dublin has an all open kitchen. The entire kitchen is open.
Awesome.
There is a certain pleasure in being able to see that instant gratification in your customers' eyes that cannot be translated by a message coming to the chef, I think. And you get a good pulse of the room, and certainly you feel part of the celebration as well. So yeah, I'm sure there's some psychology to that.
Yeah, no. I think the love that goes into food seems a bit of a messy thing to analyze scientifically or to quantify, but I think all chefs will tell you that there is something really important about the approach and the team that you have and how the menu is created and the love or the energy that goes into the food that you're making. And I think we all appreciate that when it comes to grandma's home cooking, but I don't think people necessarily, when they think of, because grandma's home cooking, I guess you're thinking of as a kind of partially emotional kind of thing, whereas I guess people are assuming when they walk into a Michelin star restaurant or any restaurant that it's a bit more,
it's all too automated,
and it's there's less heart and more
too much mechanics.
Yes, but I don't think that's necessarily true, especially when you go into fine dining. I think probably casual dining to some degree that exists, but I think at some point as well, the enjoyment that the person is taking in cooking your meal goes an awful long way into producing something that is that little bit better. It
does, absolutely. There's no doubt. I mean, we know even in terms of our produce, I know people, I've heard of people who play music to their herbs, and
sure.
You have Wagyu cows which are massaged and looked after. That the same thing applies to us as well. I think customers,
they should feed us beer and massage us.
Yes, should feel the food massaging their insides.
But so, going back to this idea then of, because you talked about the impact that chefs can have, the platform that they have, and I've talked with quite a few people about this, and I do think that it's really interesting over the last 10 years or so that there has been a dramatic increase in people's interests in not just what the chefs are cooking, but the chef's philosophy.
Correct.
Their creative process. Shows like Mind of a Chef and Chef's Table and have really tapped into a growing interest that people have in terms of the philosophies that chefs have.
Right.
I know that one of the things that you're quite passionate about is food waste.
That's right.
And that is something that we probably first talked about a few years ago, but has since become cause a lot more headlines.
For sure.
And it's become a lot more mainstream in terms of people now understand that there is a large problem with food waste.
Correct.
What is it that you've kind of been working on, or what is your approach towards this? What do you think people should know or be doing?
So I got into this whole idea of food as a force for good. Again, as part of the bigger picture of me being a chef. it seemed natural as a chef to explore ways in which food can do more than just satisfy hunger. And it was through one such engagement I came across this very small charity then called Food Cycle. And their motto was, which really struck a chord with me, was food poverty and food waste simply shouldn't coexist. Yet it does in every town, in every city, across the world. There's half the population probably going to sleep hungry, and there's weddings and celebrations and buffets and wastefulness on the other end. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to find a way to bridge that gap, and that's what Food Cycle started doing. They took they got in touch with supermarkets and took fruit and veg past their use by date. So the local supermarket would have a trolley full of, it's almost like a surprise basket. You end up in the morning to the hub kitchen, and there's a trolley outside the supermarket with lots of tomatoes, few oranges, some spinach, and something else. But essentially, we would take that to the hub kitchen and prepare a 3-course meal. We had some pantry ingredients, of course, but we would prepare a 3-course meal, largely for homeless and for the destitute.
Right, okay.
And so that was really my first dipping of my toes into food as a force for good. And that grew gradually as I discovered other food charities. I did a lot of work with Action Against Hunger, for example.
I was going to say, yeah, I've got Action Against Hunger, Akshaya Patra Foundation. That sounds, that's for children, right?
So the Akshaya Patra Foundation it has been going on in India for, I think, about 25 years now. Okay. It started off almost as a philosophy by one of the southern leaders, Oberoi, as the idea of providing a healthy noon meal at schools. And these are the government schools, so the so-called state schools. And but that was just an idea that he had in his mind, and nothing really happened. It took almost 2 decades later for the government of India to say, okay, this sounds like a good idea, perhaps we should get this started, but there's nobody who could deliver that scale across such a large country. And that's where Akshaya Patra stepped in as a charity. They offered to be the service provider. So essentially, Akshaya Patra set up kitchens and produced a nutritious vegetarian meal at lunchtime for schools. And that grew, of course. State after state adopted the policy, and today Akshaya Patra feeds almost 2.5 million school kids a nutritious meal at lunch, and every day. And
I'm guessing for some kids that would probably be the only nutritious meal.
So that's the interesting thing. So again, we talk about food as a force for good, and this is that providing of a nutritious meal is probably the only reason some parents send the kid to school, because they know, hey, we may not get a solid meal, but by going to school, our kid is going to get a meal. That results in the kid being educated and eventually bringing that family out of that cycle of poverty. So it's doing much more. It's reaching far beyond just satisfying hunger. It's providing education. It's taking that family out of a cycle of poverty. And also the fact that today Akshaya Patra serves, well, they've always wanted to be a vegetarian, nutritious meal, but their constant research has enabled them to understand child nutrition to an extent where they know that the meal that they provide ensures the kid is attentive.
All right, okay.
Unlike our school lunches here, which is French fries and burgers and hot dogs, which probably put you to sleep.
Sure.
That food is designed to wake you up, and therefore your ability to grasp knowledge is intensified.
Amazing.
Purely by having a healthy vegetarian lunch. Yes, there's protein in the form of lentils, and there's rice, and there's, I think, different states have it the menu tweaks slightly according to their preferences, but largely I would say 3 or 4 component meal, vegetarian, and it's cooked fresh on the day and it's shipped to school hot.
Wow.
So each kitchen, some of the larger kitchens,
That must be an incredible operation.
So the Akshaya Patra kitchen and the whole process has actually been a Harvard case study as well.
Right.
They've developed what they call gravity kitchens, and I'm not sure if we have enough time to go into the detail, but I'll tell you quickly. It's a kitchen laid over 3 floors.
Okay.
All the deliveries go onto the 3rd floor where they are cleaned, sorted, peeled, prepped.
Right.
And then they go into chutes in the floor, into large steam kettles or jacketed boilers. And then that is then tilted into another chute that goes straight down into containers in the transport truck on the ground floor.
Wow.
And obviously they've adopted technology to make sure that their sourcing is the best it can be at the price.
Yeah.
And their delivery mechanism, of course, I think it's a 30-minute time between leaving the unit to reaching the school. So it's hot. There's no process of reheating required. And most importantly, it's doing far more than just satisfying hunger. It's providing an education. It's ensuring the child stays in school, and that family is forever taken out of that cycle of poverty. And a lot of the kids who've gone through the system and benefited from it decide to dedicate their lives to working for the organization and delivering it even more. So I mean, I think that's been a complete eye opener for me. What you can do with food as a force for good is.
And you'd also worked with Action Against Hunger, right?
Yes. So Action Against Hunger, of course, deals more with infant malnutrition.
Yeah.
And of course, it's raising awareness about the importance of breastfeeding and making sure that infants from 0 to 3 are given the right access to food, medication, so that they can survive. Apparently, the survival rates of infants 0 to 3 in the sub-Saharan Africa and a lot of other developing countries are shocking. So obviously, Action Against Hunger has done a lot in that space, more in generating awareness. So I think as chefs here in London, we support our voice to the program. We have been out into their outreach projects in India as well to see firsthand the impacts that their work has. And all this, I think, has just helped me to grow as a person. We look at our lives in a little bubble and often ignore all these things that are happening.
Bubble.
Yes, a very privileged bubble. But it's nice to look outside that ever so often, and even if there's a small difference you can make, it all adds up.
No, I completely agree. And do you find a big difference in people's approach? Because a lot of the things that we're talking about here, like food waste, sustainability, and earlier we were talking about kind of, being vegan or vegetarian and different allergies. And do you find that setting up of it or working over here, cooking Indian food, is it very different? And I guess it must be from setting up OMYA and, how it's all Indian food, right? So it was Indian food over here and it's Indian food over there. But what are the same kind of trends, or I don't want to call necessarily these ideas like food waste and sustainability trends, but let's say the trending topics, things that people are concerned about. Are they equally as of interest to chefs and consumers in India? I
think certainly less so with consumers, sadly. I want to see a future in India where the average consumer is more discerning. But certainly chefs have been pushing the message out of eating seasonal, so there are chefs that curate menus that are entirely based on seasonal produce, local seasonal produce. That is an idea that's alien to an Indian restaurant or curry house in the UK, where the menu might as well have been printed on stone. your average curry house hasn't changed their menu for 40 years, have they?
Yeah.
But certainly this whole idea of looking at lesser known ingredients, the kind of ingredients, and I'm talking about the kind of ingredients that perhaps our grandmothers used to cook at home. It's certainly seasonal, but it's not considered restaurant food. Now I think that taboo of what is and what isn't restaurant food has moved.
Okay.
Those boundaries have cleared. Chefs are exploring these lesser known, less fashionable ingredients, but obviously ingredients that have stood the test of time. And potentially these are ingredients that have not been genetically modified or bred for the wrong reasons. These are probably more consumed in rural India. Now they are coming into the cities thanks to some of these standalone restaurants and chefs who are highlighting local produce, seasonal produce. This is a particular ingredient about. You have such short windows for some of these seasonal ingredients, like green chickpeas, for example. Is that something that's
No, not familiar
consumed
with it.
in the Middle East at all?
Not that I'm aware.
So this is, it's the raw or unripened chickpea, rather. It looks completely green. It's almost got like a furry coating on it. And it's a very short season of probably 3 weeks that it's actually available. And you would never see it on restaurant menus ever until now. You have chefs who are getting into more regional Indian cuisine, and that is, again, driving this whole ancient ingredient or native ingredient thought process, which is certainly helping. But for the longest time, I think Indian chefs in India were actually influenced by Indian chefs in London.
Really?
And I think the reason for that is the Indian consumer, again, to blame, sadly. They wanted the same old. They didn't want to accept change. I think they were happy to accept change when it came to other cuisines.
But that's kind of true. I've
accepting
heard
of
that from Mexican chefs. I've heard that from Colombian chefs. I've heard that from quite a few chefs who come from a cuisine that at some point was maybe some of the very traditional ingredients or some of the kind of very local ingredients were considered not of a gastronomic quality or standard, and that they were overlooked in some way, and that it was seen as, in some ways, peasant foods, or it was seen as cheap kind of foods that had no value put on them. And then these guys have come along. I mean, I guess Enrique Olvera, the Mexican chef behind Puyol, he's probably a really good example of that, of someone who kind of came along. And Gastronomy in Peru as well is probably a good example of someone who kind of came along and said, well, no, hang on, we have loads of great foods. We don't... Fine dining doesn't need to be French. Fine dining doesn't need to be...
And people want that narrative, don't they? Consumers are seeking that narrative about a particular ingredient or...
But the difference, I would say, just having thought about it, though, the difference, I would say, is that in somewhere like Peru, let's say, the 1% that could afford fine dining traditionally saw fine dining as being European food. The one thing I'd say about India is Indian people do appreciate good Indian food.
They do,
right?
yes.
I think they've always seen it as having its place in fine dining. That isn't a new concept, is it? Or that's not...
Or maybe they don't see it as fine dining at all. Indian food is largely accessible to the masses. We don't have ingredients like truffle, for example, that are that pricey that only a certain segment of the market can...
exclusive in any...
So, apart from saffron, which is probably one of the most expensive ingredients I can think of, but again, saffron, how much do we use saffron anyway?
Yeah.
But certainly, the cuisine, I think, of course, there's a lot of difference between what pheasant food, what we would refer to as pheasant food, and what we find on restaurant tables, for sure. But today, with the rise of standalone restaurants niche restaurants focused on one micro cuisine, the need to explore ingredients specific to that region become all the more important, and that has led this trend of unearthing these less fashionable ingredients.
So what do you think the future of Indian dining is here in the UK? Because we've had Indian food as part of, as I said, it's become so part of the culture that there are dishes that are now more British than they are Indian, made of Indian ingredients using Indian techniques. What's the future? Now we've come to, as you said, when you got your Michelin star, we've come to understand that Indian can be fine dining and that it can be very refined in terms of the way it's presented, both as ingredients, in the setting, in the whole experience.
I think
what's the future?
I think my approach when I moved to London was to focus on authenticity of flavor, but using the best local ingredients that we have. So we had dishes on our menu that would be alien to an Indian restaurant menu in India, dishes like scallops, jandori. That was the best local produce we were using, and marrying it with a marinade or a paste or an ingredient that gave it that traditional aspect. I think what I would like to see as the future of Indian food in this country, and by saying that I mean I consider London to be at the very forefront of where Indian cuisine is headed, and long may that continue. But where I would like it to head is to bridge that gap between that ancient knowledge that we had of the curative properties of our food with this whole access to fantastic ingredients that we have in London, and almost be the kind of medium that is able to promote food as a means of well-being, lifestyle. That's what I would really like to see. I think almost going back in time to the time of what is the very core that we can take out of the science of Ayurveda, apply that to what we do today, and to all the technology available to us. Can we be in a position where Indian becomes the
healthy
go-to healthy food,
the medicinal food,
which I think for me would be the biggest success, because the one perception I've had to battle in the UK from day one was largely negative perceptions associated with this great cuisine that was much enjoyed, but they would largely say, "Oh, it's too strong for lunch. I can't have Indian for lunch. I can't. It's too heavy. I might fall asleep in the afternoon. I have an important meeting. I can't do Indian for lunch." So heavy, greasy, oily, spicy. These were the kind of largely negative connotations to a cuisine that they actually loved, and for me, I think
it's considered a bit of a kind of indulgent food, I guess, right? I think if you just look at the general kind of in the UK, if maybe general perception, I guess I'd never thought about that, whether people would, because you're right, I guess when people are thinking about lunch or lighter meals,
there are certainly other cuisines that are perceived to be lighter. Japanese, of course, ticks all the boxes for lunch. But I think for me, as a chef, the challenge was to take on those perceptions and turn them around. How could a land that invented Ayurveda and yoga be associated with all negative connotations in its food? Whereas historically, the cuisine of our land was based on its medicinal properties, eating local, eating seasonal, all the buzzwords of today. Who would have thought yoga and Ayurveda are going to be so fashionable now? And yet this is ancient knowledge. We are talking 6,000 BC, I think. That's an insane time.
That qualifies as being ancient.
Yes. So certainly to see those negative perceptions turned around on their head.
And do you think that's happening? I think that's happening, is it not?
I think for sure. The very fact that you have a turmeric latte in Starbucks today is a step in the right direction for me, certainly.
In the terms of it being very mainstream, that's interesting.
And also the shift from a generic curry house across the length and the breadth of the country, all their menus would be exactly the same. We've been moving now towards digging a little deeper under the water of that iceberg that you can see as Indian cuisine, and going into a better understanding of regional cuisines, appreciating the subtle differences in how spices are used across the different regions of India. And I think global travel has enabled that to a great extent. People are curious. They want to go off the beaten track. They want to try out the lesser known dishes, and I think that's happening across all cuisines globally. I think people are able to discern between, say, Kerala and food of Kolkata and the food of Delhi, and that's nice, and long may that continue. So the rise of these micro cuisines again is enriching the population about Indian cuisine a lot more than what the curry houses did, because that was a very narrow bandwidth of Indian cuisine, if I might say so. So certainly,
I think in the UK at least, most curry houses were owned by people from Bangladesh.
That's right. Absolutely.
I found that out at university because a very good friend of mine, university, his family owned a chain of curry houses. Correct. And he said, no,
that's true. And
he told me something like 80 to 90% of curry houses were owned by people coming from Bangladesh.
But at its peak, there were about 9,500 Bangladeshi-run curry houses in the country, and that's a shocking statistic. But I'm guessing 9,000 of those had exactly the same menu.
Probably, yeah.
And they were cooking food not that they identify with themselves, but food they thought the clientele could tolerate, which was such an unfortunate approach to exporting a cuisine. We struggling generations later to undo a lot of that damage.
But I think it's being undone. I definitely do. I mean, I
think
people's approach towards Indian food now,
certainly travel has changed that.
Yeah, and I think people have a much broader perspective on it now than they ever have. And I think the rise of street food as well has been a good one in terms of bringing out maybe lesser known dishes or ingredients in some way.
I think there's been certainly an explosion of that mid-market.
Yeah.
Perhaps post 2008, the financial crisis, where of course there was a natural weeding out of concepts. But that in those gaps came in this mid-market that was non-existent prior to that. It suddenly became the most important sector in restaurants. I mean, there was always a high-end and your fast food and fried chicken shops. That mid-market was never as good as it is now. And that's true of most global cities, actually. So that's been certainly the biggest change for London across cuisine. The more affordable premium, as you would call it. And I think the fact that our clientele are now much more looking for big picture. They look for sustainability. They look for the ethics behind the organization. They look at your sourcing. They look at your provenance. I know you asked me earlier whether chefs are driving sustainability, but I think it's both ways. Customers are certainly demanding we address all these issues, and chefs are rising to the challenge, of course, but it's largely thanks to the millennial population, where their food choices are based more on just instant gratification. It's a little bigger picture than that. It's about where does it come from? How is it treated? Is it well looked after? Is it economically viable? Is it sustainable? And all these elements that our generation did not make enough noise about. I remember as a kid I was aware of global warming. I don't think I made enough of noise. Certainly to see the millennials now driving.
We had Captain Planet telling us.
But certainly they are driving change now like never before. And all of us are responding certainly to that.
So if people want to try your food, do they have to be in India, in New Delhi and Dublin?
Well,
when are we going to get?
Well, I'm cooking at Gleneagles next month. Actually, I'm doing so that's it's a one-night gala dinner.
Okay.
So that's on the 10th of October.
Okay.
Sorry, 10th of November. I'm sorry.
10th of November.
And but the clubhouse at Gleneagles has a bit of a Indian section on the menu.
Okay.
And essentially my quarterly dinners are aimed at tweaking around those dishes.
Okay.
So I do a gala dinner for about 150, and then I train the team on changes to that Indian and tandoor menu for the next few months, and then I'm back. But I'm certainly cooking in Delhi in December. I'll be there between Christmas and New Year.
Amazing.
A couple of trips now to Dublin
I was going to
next
say
week.
Doolally. And whereabouts is this?
Doolali's on Richmond Road in Dublin. It's the heart of the food and drink district. Beautiful site, really. So that's a nice place to try. But otherwise, in London, you got to be lucky enough to be invited to my home, and that reminds me, we need to have you over.
Well, I'm waiting for an invitation then. Alfred, thank you so much for joining us.
Joseph, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you, and hope to see you again soon.
Awesome. Thank you.